Okay, so I'm going to do this quickly, but we're going to start with this line here, the green line. Can you see, Elizabeth? This is the line that is basically the city. Okay, it's like, well, it's going to contain the city. And then you have the city here, which is on the edge of the fall into the abyss. You guys with me? So when you make the city, you have to put it on the edge, because at the edge of the city, we have what's called infernal comedy, which is dark comedy. And I think I'm going to erase this hell part, because it's not really hell. It's just dark. So we live here in the city, okay? This is us. This is my lover. Hopefully you have a person to share the city with, like a husband or a wife or somebody like that, okay? There are three kinds of, this is the realm of comedy. The city's the realm of comedy. There's three kinds of comedy. There's infernal comedy, purgatorial comedy, paradisal comedy. We live here in purgatorial comedy, okay? Infernal comedy is where everyone's dying around you, but you didn't die. In fact, the whole thing about comedy is, but did you die? If you didn't die, you're still alive, you're the comic hero of your own story, living in the world, doing all the things, okay? Paradisal comedy is where the hero approaches heaven and sees the light of God. Dr. Cowan, in her essay, she says that the only true paradisal comedy was from Dante's Divine Paradise. Also, the city is any place of structure where people live. So like this classroom is a city, the building's a city, Keller's a city, Texas is a city, America is a city, if that makes sense. Okay? Why do we have to live in the city? Where else is there to live? There's only two other places on this board that we could live in. We could live in the abyss, which you can't live in. You die in the abyss. Or we could go out to nature and live in the woods, off the grid. That never works out for people, though. So nature is outside the city. It's called the green space. And it's one of the beloved objects. Remember we talked about the three beloved objects? Art, nature, and lover. This is where people go to regain their sanity. So if the city is too much for you, like if all of this structure and all these rules are overwhelming, go on a hike. Or get your camera and take photographs. Or just go outside of structure. This is a protected structure because it's not the abyss. It's outside the walls of the city, but it's not so far away that it's chaos. Now, if you know you're going on a hike, you prepare yourself, right? You have food, you have water, you have maybe a GPS. If you go on a hike and get lost, is that still a beloved object? No, now it becomes chaos because you might die. So who is the tragic hero? Well, the tragic hero 99% of the time is male. Why? Because he possesses too much mast. He crashes the boat. So this is the masculine mass that moves the city into bigger and greater things. And this is the feminine boat that holds. So what happens here is the mast gets too big for the boat. The tragic hero succumbs to one of his 7 deadly sins. The Greeks would have called it hamartia, which means literally to miss the mark. So if you're shooting a bow and arrow and you miss the mark, that's hamartia. So we all are guilty of one of these to a certain extent. Maybe you eat too much. Maybe you get over angry. Maybe you're envious of other people. So let's say we have a leader. Well, every city, every body. I'm the leader of this classroom. Ms. Burrell's the leader of the school. We have a mayor. We have a governor. We have a president. Everybody has. There's always a leader. There has to be. The problem, what happens in tragedy is when the leader starts to feel himself way too much. And he starts to think, and maybe he's greed, maybe it's greed. And he's like, oh, I can get even more now? Oh, awesome. And so he gets too big for himself. And in the process of getting too big for himself, the entire city crashes. So think about Hitler, right? He had the sin of wrath. He was mad at one Jewish lady, a nurse, who took care of his mother when she was dying. And so all Jews are bad because one Jewish nurse, his mother died under the care of one Jewish nurse. So now what happens? He's like, instead of just being mad at that one lady, he takes it out on 6 million Jews. So Hitler, in his excessive wrath, pulls the entire country of Germany into the abyss. Would we agree with that? Is Germany still there? Right. So it was still there. The structures were still there. There were people still living there. People who didn't die in the war or whatever. So now what has to happen to Germany after it goes to the abyss? It has to come back here and rebuild. It has to fight, build, and rule the city of justice. What is the city of justice? It's the balance of the masculine and the feminine. You don't want too much, but you're not going anywhere. Does that make sense? So you should desire things, but then you should also look back and say, okay, so how can I pull back a little bit and not get myself into another Nazi situation? Like if you're the country of Germany, right? What did we learn from the last guy who took our society into the abyss? And if you look at Germany, they have actually learned their lessons. They've kept up all their concentration camps. People take trips to them. You cannot fly a Nazi flag in Germany. You can fly one here, but you can't fly one in Germany. It's actually against the law. Did you know that? Because of what happened before. So here we go. We have a cycle. You build the city. You rule the city. Hopefully you don't get somebody in power who will crash the city. If they do, you got to rebuild the city. Make sense? So where does lyric come into this? Where does poetry come into all of this? Well, if you've seen some things, in the words of a famous philosopher named Nietzsche, if you look into the abyss will look back at you. So when you look into the darkness of the abyss, or even the light of God, those two things will look back at you. So let's say that think about soldiers in a war. When soldiers go to war, do they come back whole? W-H-O-L-E? No. They're broken. Some of them may climb out of the abyss of war, come back into the city, and they may find that there's an art that they can find to save their life. There's a guy named I think it's Gary Soto or somebody like that. He wrote an essay called "How Poetry Saved My Life." He was a Vietnam veteran. So he brings the artist or the person who survives the abyss, we would call it hell in our Christian understanding of things, comes back. I mean, you don't survive literal hell, right? But I'm talking about like the hell of war, the hell of abuse, things like that. Brings this language, or brings these things that he or she has seen back into the city. So the poet climbs out of chaos and brings his or her story and language back to the city, and the city basically rejects the poet. Why would the city reject the poet? Why would the city reject that language? Is it fun? Is it fun to hear about somebody's war stories? Is it fun to hear about somebody's abuse? Not fun. So what happens oftentimes, and the reason 22 veterans a day commit suicide, is because the city rejects them and says, go away, it's too dark. And then they're alone, and they decide to take their own life. Because they cannot, the darkness is too much. What saves people from that darkness is what we call these little pockets right here. These little pockets of community called communitas. This is where you practice your art. Whether that's writing poetry, whether that's playing the guitar, whether that's teaching. If you don't have that and you've seen some things, then you might be left to your own devices, and those devices might be deadly. Does that make sense? People commit suicide when they don't have anything else. That's their last resort. So that's where we get lyric poetry. Now, if you guys could get out your lyric essay that I gave you. Can I give it to you yet? You can stop that.